So today I want to talk about some of the common project management problems that come at scale. In general, when we're talking about a single team, there's definitely complexity to deal with that, but we get into a whole nother realm when we're talking about multiple teams or teams of teams. As soon as we get to that meta level where we have multiple different teams and we're trying to manage them across different value streams, different groups, different departments, whatever it may be, there's just a lot of complexity to untangle there. And today I want to start looking at some of those questions. So we have these multiple teams. We want to understand how they're doing work. So how complex is the project that they're working on? How complex are those interdependencies? Are these siloed projects that can exist in a vacuum, or are they highly interrelated with a lot of cross-team interdependencies to deal with? Then we can get into the issue of scale. How many teams are there? How big are they? How much related work do they have to other teams? And then how are those teams working? How are they, getting through their backlog? So, maybe they're taking an Agile approach, maybe they're taking a Waterfall approach, maybe they're doing something else. There's a lot of different ways that we can approach this. And in my experience, when we've got multiple teams, we've probably got multiple different ways of working. And that could be different flavors of Agile. That could be a mix of that and other methodologies. There's a lot of room for negotiation here, on top of the fact that Agile is almost always a la carte. It's almost always, we're taking these bits and we're ignoring these bits that aren't relevant for us. Then we need to get to understanding, how information is radiated and communicated across teams. So how are they sharing information? How are they, communicating and facilitating updates? Is there a single source of truth that we're looking at? There's a lot of questions around that. And then, how are we measuring progress and how are we viewing progress across these teams? So in general, I find that there's almost always a way to view progress for each individual team. The problem becomes, if we've got 10 teams, how can we view their overall progress at that higher level? And this can be difficult because they can have different teams that are calculating progress in different ways that have different shortfalls. So maybe we don't just want to kind of lump them all together. And then this last one is easy to miss here. How is planning being done? Are our teams using different planning methodologies? Because if it's just Waterfall, work is kind of being pushed down onto them. If it's more Agile, they're taking work off the stack and committing to it. There's a lot of different variants in how these are actually managed, but ultimately this is slightly different from whether they're working Agile or Waterfall. It's really more about how the specific planning process can be done. So obviously Agile has ideas about this and Waterfall has ideas about this, but we could be have two different teams that are both working Scrum, they're both working, in an Agile fashion, but maybe they do planning slightly differently. So it's slight nuance there to what's going on. Then we've got to get to the question of how we're even defining teams. Like, what does a team mean? This is another one that's easy to miss. We might often assume like there is a way to define teams, but I tell you, there's a lot of times I find, well, how do we define the team? And it's just like, well, somebody knows. Like, there's not necessarily something direct to point to. So it's great when teams are individual projects. We can point to that and say, this is the team. This is what the team's working on. Sometimes we have those cross-functional teams, working across multiple projects. We can also have work that's responsible to multiple teams when we're doing components and things like that. So maybe we have an epic that's responsible to multiple teams. Hopefully we're breaking down that work into, stories that are individually assignable to teams. But again, seen a lot of variation in this. Of course, there's the option of teams as a custom field. And although I wouldn't recommend it, I see teams as an almost indecipherable JQL function a lot of the time. So now we've got an idea of what our teams are and how they're linked together, how they're working. We can start to try to address these metrics. So usually teams have methods of estimation, but there's a lot of different ways out there. There's multiple different ways of dealing with story points alone, much less, other types of estimation. You might have one using the time tracking fields and one using story points and another one using story points that means something totally different. And then another one doing t-shirt sizing. There's a lot of different ways of estimating work. Status is, of course, a great metric. Hopefully this is communicating, what stage things are in. There's obviously a lot of complexity we can get to with those workflows and things like that. This can be a great place for looking for those metrics. Again, we want to talk about those links and dependencies. We want to understand how these teams have that interrelated work. Dates are great, but I don't know how much I see them, especially in the Agile world. The idea of we've got a specific deadline is not necessarily super favorable. But if we do have something like that, that can be great to point to, maybe a less common use case. But of course, within Jira, there's a lot of customization. I always see, some level of custom fields, custom issue types, custom links. And then there's a lot of other built-ins that we haven't even mentioned yet, such as, fixed versions or sprints or labels. There's a lot of different pieces of information, but ultimately we want to just categorize these. We can have a bunch of different teams on different types of estimation, but just understanding, do they estimate or not? Do they have a status flow, or maybe that, there's something else, are they looking at links? What are the important fields? Maybe they don't have dates at all, but just kind of posing the question, which of these categories is the team kind of filling into? So continuing on this multi-team example, let's talk about, something a little bit more concrete. So we can make some assumptions. Teams being heterogeneous is pretty much always true. Maybe you run into that lucky situation where there's only one or two outlier teams and the majority are kind of working in a somewhat repeatable fashion. But it's very, very rare that I hear, oh yeah, we got 20, 30 teams and they all work in the exact same way, all estimate in the exact same way. There's almost always some sort of outlier. We'll assume that there's some sort of interdependent work. If all these teams are siloed, we're not even really dealing with a multi-team example. Maybe we're trying to roll up and understand that work, but it's not necessarily something that has to be all put together. And part of that teams being heterogeneous means that those teams are using different methods of estimation. We can safely assume that they've probably got some differences in all of those categories of fields that we were just talking about. So they probably have different estimation, some differences around estimation, some differences around, their statuses, some differences around their dates, and possibly some differences around the way that they handle linking and managing projects and other custom fields. We're also going to assume that our teams are using different planning methodologies. So the way that they're pulling work off the backlog might be slightly different. This is easy enough to understand. In Scrum, we're probably going into a planning session and we're, committing to a couple of things that we're going to put into, the next 2 week or three, whatever cadence sprint we've got going on. But if we're Kanban, it's just, I'm done with this. I'm grabbing the next thing and putting the next, item into that in progress stack. So how we're planning, how we're pulling work down can be very different, even if we're both, technically agile teams. And then the other thing that's really important to remember is the teams want to track different metrics. So, maybe for one team, going back to a more Scrum example, maybe story points and making sure that they're not, overloading their team is kind of the primary. For a Kanban team, maybe those estimations aren't important. They're just trying to limit, what work is in progress or in certain status flows. So, different things are going to be important to different teams. And it might be, this team focuses on X, this team focuses on Y. And when we're looking at the roll-up, we're focusing on something totally different. So we need to understand that different groups and different perspectives are going to have different things that are important to them. So there's not going to be a one size fits all here. And this is the last one. This is possibly the only constant that you will find, and that is that the team is going to be resistant to change. If you come in and say, we're going to bring in a new tool and we're going to bring in a new process and we're going to change this, we're going to change that, people are naturally resistant to change. So we're trying to change as little as possible. It doesn't mean we can't change things. It doesn't mean we can't, make optimizations and improvements. It just means we want those things to be very small, calculated changes. We don't want to pull the rug out from under people. We don't want to, stop the world, change it the way that everything works, because that's just going to result in wasted effort. So, looking at Jira out of the box, works for great. Teams definitely love it, are familiar with it. Highly configurable and customizable, especially we've got all these different teams working in different ways, that's going to be super important. And it provides a really great foundation for individual teams. And I think it works really well at that single team level. The problem is when we get into this multi-team projects at a higher level, we can find that it can be a little bit limiting. So, how are we going to take these things to the next level? Like, what's the next, kind of logical level of grouping? Maybe that's our project, maybe that's our team. There's a lot of other things that we can do this on. I particularly like higher level issue, kind of like a safe sort of view. So, we've got something like an initiative that our epics break down into, and we can create multiple levels on top of that. And that's generally something that doesn't really fit well into the standard Jira paradigm. And of course, we do have this option to do arbitrary grouping. It's definitely not the first choice. It's definitely not, kind of the first tool that I reach for. It's always nice when we can point to a specific field or fixed version or what have you. But yeah, we can do it something completely arbitrary if the information doesn't exist in Jira. So let's take this to a structure example. So what is structure? Structure is this visualization tool that helps us to build hierarchies. So we can group on all the attributes that we were just talking about, build hierarchies on those attributes. So we have, as I said, an initiative that might break down to an epic, and that epic might break down to stories, and those stories might break down to subtasks. And that can help us roll up all this information, because maybe above the initiative is the actual team level, and then above that team level is our kind of multi-team of team of teams level. And even though we've got multiple teams working in multiple different projects with different fields and things that are important to them, we can still find a way to roll that up onto that kind of top level 10,000 foot view. So it's a really great way to, make a large confusing data set meaningful and understandable at a glance. One of my favorites is definitely the ability to perform those calculations with Expert. I come from a software development background. I'm just like, let me get in there and write some code, solve some problems. And of course, the icing on the cake is kind of being able to visualize that data with color. So, this is how we can radiate information across teams. Get that buy-in, make sure that, people are committing to that work, taking ownership of it. We understand that everything in this view is the stuff that we're doing. If it's not in here, it's not the stuff that we're working on. We get that single source of truth. Everyone has, clarity on what the backlog of work is. Makes it easier to report to leadership, roll that status and progress up, understand, those risks, those blockers. And as these things change in real time, sometimes you're looking at an issue and it doesn't have any blockers, there's nothing going on. And then later in the day, it's changed, it's updated, now there's something blocking it. Now there's a related issue that's at risk. So being able to track these things in real time is definitely critical. And that's why, because we're tracking it in real time, we're never worrying that this data is out of date. It's always, the most up to date, the freshest data that we can possibly making decisions on. And the other thing that's really easy to overlook it, and I always want to caution people about this is not the end. This is very much the beginning. So when we create these views and start looking at this data, it's not, oh, this is what's happening, this is the deadline, or this is how much work we have to do, or this or that. This is the model that we're using to try to understand reality. And so the first question that we have to ask is, does this model reality well? Does this plan make sense? Does this reflect the actual work that we're doing? Is this goal achievable? Is what this data is outputting something that we think correlates well to reality. And, hopefully the answer is yes, but sometimes the answer is no, and that's totally okay. But again, this is not the end. This is where we begin the conversation. And we say, does this, look like something real? And throughout, I've been talking a lot about this idea of mixing Agile and Waterfall, and ultimately, we don't care. Structure has no opinion on whether you should be working Agile and Waterfall. I personally happen to have experience working in Agile, and I'm a big fan of Agile, but I mean, if you want to plan in Waterfall, there's absolutely nothing stopping you. In fact, I think we have a lot of good tools for working with that. But this is just a really simple example right here. We're basically saying, if story points exist, we're going to multiply that by 8 to treat story points as an 8-hour day. Otherwise, we're going to have the original estimate. And this is that idea of, one team working with story points, one team working with original estimate. We can still roll that up into a single view and unify that really, really easily. So of course, we could write something much more complex. If we had 8 different teams, 8 different types of estimation, that's not necessarily going to be a problem. But yeah, we give you the tools to try to cut through that complexity. And ultimately, structure wants to be able to map to your current work process so that we don't have to change anything else. You can just have the tool adapt the way you work instead of having it do it the other way around. So I often think of this kind of multi-team overview as a portfolio overview. You got a portfolio of products. So here I have, my core product. Structure is one of our core products. And then underneath that, we're breaking down to the actual epics and stories and subtasks and what needs to be done. So this is a, pretty close to real world example of how this can look. But again, there's a lot of flexibility around how you manage and build these hierarchies, what information you want to extract, because there's going to be a lot of differences between what's important to what teams and people at different parts of the hierarchy in the organization. Leadership is probably going to want to see something very different than a developer working on a particular bug, and that's okay. Yeah, enough with the pictures and the slideshow. Let's take a look at an actual structure here. So here I have a very similar, structure overview. And, again, I have my core products. Structure is one of my core products. And then I'm actually grouping by my individual teams. So I have a core team and a structure team. They both have their own, individual pieces of work that are going to be epics. And we can see it looks like team core is at risk here. So it looks like some of these items are a little bit behind schedule. But if I do something like maybe transition some of these, I can see them move forward. So now this one is okay because it's in progress. It's no longer maybe behind schedule. These, and this is ultimately a formula that is updating in real time. So whenever any of the fields that this formula relies on are changing, it's going to change the output here. But it's a really nice way to view information. It's also a really nice view for editing. All of these fields are going to be editable from status assignee, story points. We've got a lot of configurability here, so we can control what's shown and what isn't. And of course, I think we've got some really great options for filtering this out. So I can just look at stuff that's assigned to me, which appears to be nothing, but I can add additional groupings, like grouping it by assignee and status, maybe to see, who's working on what and what stage that work is in. But ultimately, structure wants to be as flexible as possible. And that allows each individual team to work in their own way. So your Scrum team has their stuff organized by sprint. And, I've got a sprint structure right here. So I've got a bunch of bugs and stories that are organized into their own individual sprints. But, for a Kanban team, they'd be more interested in the statuses, or maybe another team would be more interested in by version. There's a lot of different ways that we can slice and dice this data. And that's by design, because different people in different parts of the organization are going to have very different needs. And you're going to need a tool that accommodates that. So that is everything I wanted to show today. Thank you so much for joining my talk. We're really happy to be supporting PM72 and the Malala charity. And yeah, if you have more questions, please check out ALM Works or alm.works/structure, or send us an email at solutions@almworks.com. But yeah, thanks a lot for your time, and good luck.